In 1977, inside a Chicago dealership service bay, a loyal buyer opened the hood of a brand new Oldsmobile Delta 88. They had paid for the engineering reputation of Lansing, Michigan, but under the hood they found an engine painted corporate blue instead of Oldsmobile gold. It was a 330 cubic inch Chevrolet V8. This discovery sparked the Chevy Mobile scandal. Class action lawsuits flooded the courts. Tens of thousands of buyers realized the unique mechanical identity of Oldsmobile had been quietly outsourced to another branch of General Motors. It broke a silent contract of mechanical trust. The paradox was deeper than a swapped engine block. 3 decades earlier, Oldsmobile did not need to borrow horsepower. They had built the exact machine that forced Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler to entirely redesign how they generated power. The brand caught sneaking corporate engines into its bays was the same brand that had engineered the modern American V8. The real story of the Rocket V8 is not only a corporate lawsuit, it is the story of how a specific piece of iron taught a post-war nation what highway speed sounded like, and what happened when Detroit decided that identity was simply too expensive to keep. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific mechanical problem. In Lansing, Michigan, in the years right after the Second World War. In the years immediately following the Second World War, America was a country accelerating toward the future, but it was doing so using engines trapped in the past. The American highway system was beginning to expand. New suburbs were being drawn into the dirt outside major cities. Returning soldiers had money, and the automotive industry was rushing to build larger, heavier, more comfortable cars to match the scale of post-war ambition. But beneath the hoods of these massive steel vehicles, the mechanical reality was painfully outdated. Most American cars of the late 1940s were powered by straight eights, inline sixes, or flathead V8s. A flathead, an engine design where the valves sit down inside the engine block rather than up in the cylinder head, had been the standard of American power for decades. Ford had made the flathead V8 a legend in 1932, and it was cheap to manufacture, durable, and familiar to every mechanic with a wrench. But the flathead had a hard physical limit. Because the air and fuel had to travel up from the block and over into the cylinder, the combustion chamber was long and wide. This geometry meant the engine could not achieve high compression. Compression, the squeezing of the air and fuel mixture inside the cylinder before combustion, is the secret to making an engine efficient. The harder you squeeze the mixture before the spark plug fires, the more mechanical energy you extract from every drop of fuel. But if you tried to raise the compression on a flathead, the engine could not breathe properly, and the fuel would detonate uncontrollably. American automakers had hit a cast iron ceiling. They could make engines larger, but they could not make them much better. The breakthrough did not begin on an assembly line. It began with fuel. During the war, the military required massive quantities of 100-octane aviation gasoline to keep heavily armored bombers in the sky. Charles Kettering, the legendary head of General Motors Research, realized that once the war ended, the American petroleum industry would have the refining capacity to pump high-octane gasoline directly into civilian gas stations. High-octane fuel can withstand massive pressure without detonating early. Kettering knew that if he could build an engine capable of handling that pressure, he could change the American automotive industry forever. In 1947, Kettering presented a paper to the Society of Automotive Engineers. He proved that an engine operating with a 12.1 compression ratio could increase fuel economy by 30 to 40% while generating massive torque. But to achieve that ratio, the flathead had to die. Inside General Motors, the task of turning Kettering's theory into a mass production reality fell to the engineers at Oldsmobile. Based in Lansing, Michigan, Oldsmobile was GM's historical engineering laboratory, a division known for introducing the automatic transmission to the masses. Chief engineer Gilbert Burrell and his team in Lansing knew that to handle the pressure Kettering envisioned, they needed a completely new architecture. They built an overhead valve design. An overhead valve engine, often abbreviated as OHV, is a design where the valves are moved up out of the engine block and relocated into the cylinder head, directly above the pistons, operated by push rods. By putting the valves in the head, the Lansing engineers could cast a compact, wedge-shaped combustion chamber. It allowed the engine to breathe deeper. More importantly, it allowed the pistons to squeeze the fuel-air mixture incredibly tight. In late 1948, for the 1949 model year, the Lansing foundries began casting the result. They called it the Rocket V8. A V8, an 8-cylinder engine with cylinders arranged in two banks in a V-shape, was not new to America. But the Rocket was entirely different from the pre-war iron. It displaced 303 cubic inches. Displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders, was only part of the equation. Because of its overhead valve design and a 7.25:1 compression ratio, which was incredibly high for the era, the 303 produced 135 horsepower. More crucially, it produced 253 pound-feet of torque at a low and 800 RPM. Torque, the twisting force of the engine, felt by the driver as pulling strength, was what actually moved a heavy American car away from a stoplight. At 1,800 RPM, the Rocket delivered its maximum pulling power right where normal American drivers needed it. The engine was a masterclass in heavy-duty metallurgy. It featured a forged steel crankshaft that could withstand immense downward pressure from the pistons. It utilized a rigid, heavily ribbed cast iron block that refused to flex under load, and it featured hydraulic valve lifters. In older engines, mechanics had to regularly open the engine and manually adjust the clearance of the solid valve lifters to keep the engine from clattering. The Rocket's hydraulic lifters used engine oil pressure to automatically maintain zero clearance, meaning the engine ran quietly and required far less routine maintenance at the dealership service bays. Furthermore, the Lansing engineers designed the 303 with an over-square layout, meaning the bore, the width of the cylinder, was larger than the stroke, the distance the piston traveled up and down. A short stroke meant the pistons traveled slower even at higher engine speeds, drastically reducing friction and cylinder wear. It was built to live on the new high-speed interstates that were about to be paved across the country. The Oldsmobile Rocket V8 immediately created an industrial moat. Ford was still selling the venerable but aging flathead. Chevrolet and Plymouth were still relying on reliable but slow inline-sixes. Chrysler would not release its own overhead valve Hemi for another 2 years. In a single engineering cycle, Oldsmobile had made the rest of the American automotive industry look like they were selling antique machinery. But originally, GM executives envisioned the Rocket V8 as a luxury power plant. They planned to install the 303 cubic inch engine exclusively in the massive, heavy Oldsmobile 98 series. It was intended to be a smooth, quiet, effortless engine for doctors, bankers, and executives pulling into paved driveways. The block was ready, but power hidden in a heavy luxury car is just momentum. To change American culture, the Rocket needed a chassis light enough to let it fly. In 1949, the engineers in Lansing made a corporate decision that would accidentally rewrite the American social contract with speed. Originally, the 303 cubic inch Rocket V8 was engineered to move the massive, heavy Oldsmobile 98 series. It was a luxury power plant for a luxury buyer. But someone inside General Motors realized that the new engine block was relatively compact. Oldsmobile also manufactured a much smaller, lighter entry-level line of cars called the 76 series, which was normally powered by a sluggish inline-six. They decided to pull the six-cylinder out, drop the 303 Rocket V8 into the lighter chassis, and rebadge the creation as the Oldsmobile 88. By doing this, Oldsmobile drastically altered the power-to-weight ratio, a mathematical measurement of how much heavy steel each unit of engine horsepower actually has to push. When you placed 135 horsepower and 253 pound-feet of torque into a heavy luxury sedan, the result was smooth, quiet momentum. But when you bolted that exact same cast-iron V8 into a stripped-down lightweight family coupe, the result was violent, immediate acceleration. In an American post-war suburb, the Oldsmobile 88 meant that a middle-class buyer with a normal paycheck could pull away from a stoplight and completely outrun a wealthy executive in a top-tier luxury car. Speed was no longer strictly guarded by wealth. The modern American performance car had just been born, a full 15 years before anyone would invent the phrase muscle car. But the true breakthrough of the Rocket V8 did not happen at a suburban stoplight. It happened in the dirt. In 1947, an organization called NASCAR was formed to formalize stock car racing across the American South. In its earliest days, the tracks were primarily carved out of red clay, or they were run directly on the packed sand of Daytona Beach. The fields were heavily dominated by Ford flathead V8s. Mechanics and moonshiners knew how to modify the old flatheads, but the engines suffered from a mechanical ceiling. Then the Oldsmobile 88 arrived on the dirt. Because of its high compression and overhead valve layout, the rocket engine could breathe deeper and rev higher than any flathead on the track. It utilized a dual downdraft carburetor, a mechanical device that mixes fuel and air in precise ratios before the mixture is pulled down into the engine's intake manifold. As the flathead Fords gasped for air at high RPMs on the long straightaways, the Oldsmobile's carburetor poured a steady, atomized mixture into its wedge-shaped combustion chambers. The results were immediate and absolute. In 1949, legendary driver Red Byron won the first NASCAR Strictly Stock Championship, driving an Oldsmobile 88. In 1950, the Rocket V8 became an unstoppable industrial force on the track. Drivers like Fonnie Flock and Bill Rexford pushed the engine to its limits. That season, Oldsmobile won 10 out of the 19 Grand National races. For the mechanics working in the pits, the Rocket V8 proved something crucial. General Motors had built a factory engine that was more durable than heavily modified racing engines. The forged steel crankshafts held together under the extreme sustained stress of Daytona. The engine blocks did not crack. The American public was watching factory-spec, dealership-bought iron-to-feet highly tuned competition. The racing dominance fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the Oldsmobile brand. It was no longer just a reliable car for doctors and bankers. It was a weapon. And that mechanical reputation soon crossed over from the dirt track to the airwaves. In March 1951, a band led by Ike Turner, featuring a saxophone player and singer named Jackie Brenston, walked into the Memphis Recording Service studio. They had written a song celebrating the fastest, most desirable machine on the American highway. The song was called Rocket 88. With its distorted guitar and driving rhythm, the track became a massive hit on the R&B charts, and historians widely consider it to be the first rock and roll record ever produced. The Oldsmobile engine had transcended its cast iron block. It was no longer just a General Motors product. It had become an American cultural identity. It represented youth, movement, volume, and rebellion. Back in American garages and machine shops, another cultural shift was happening. Returning GIs and young hot rodders in California had spent the late 1940s tuning pre-war Ford flatheads to race on dry lake beds. But when the Rocket V8 arrived, they realized that even a heavily modified flathead could barely match the power of a bone-stock Oldsmobile engine. A new rhythm emerged in the salvage yards. When a new Oldsmobile 88 was wrecked on the highway, hot rodders would immediately descend on the junkyard to harvest the engine block. They unbolted the Rocket V8, dragged it back to their garages, and swapped it into the engine bays of lightweight 1932 Ford Roadsters. It was an engine swap that defined early hot rod culture. Mechanics discovered that the heavily ribbed, over-engineered Oldsmobile block could handle even more compression, larger carburetors, and aggressive camshafts without failing. By the early 1950s, the Lansing plant was running at maximum capacity to keep up with dealer orders. The Rocket had taught American buyers that an engine could be a status symbol all on its own. The Rocket had proven its power on the dirt tracks and the airwaves. But Detroit was about to realize that horsepower was not just a feature, it was a war. By 1954, the American automotive landscape had entirely transformed. The flathead era was effectively dead. Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler had rushed their own overhead valve V8s into production just to survive the new market reality that Oldsmobile had created. Detroit was no longer just building transportation. It was building an arms race of iron and compression. To maintain their dominance, the Lansing engineers realized that the original 303 cubic inch block had room to grow. In 1954, they bored and stroked the engine, machining the cylinders wider and lengthening the distance the pistons traveled up and down to increase the overall displacement. The result was the 324 cubic inch Rocket V8. Horsepower jumped, but more importantly, the torque swelled. The Lansing engine plant in Michigan became a fortress of American manufacturing. Inside the foundries, thousands of tons of molten iron were poured into sand molds every week to cast the heavily ribbed engine blocks. Machinists and union assembly workers operated around the clock, cutting decks and boring cylinders to exacting factory tolerances. The Oldsmobile dealership network, once accustomed to selling quiet luxury sedans to conservative retirees, was suddenly filled with young returning veterans and hot rodders, analyzing camshaft specifications and rear-end gear ratios over the parts counter. The torque war escalated again in 1957 with the introduction of the 371 cubic inch Rocket V8. But the peak of 1950s Oldsmobile engineering was not just the size of the block, it was how the engine breathed. That year, Oldsmobile introduced an option known on the factory order sheets as the J2. The J2 Tri-Power was a specialized fuel delivery system featuring three two-barrel carburetors sitting in line on top of a specific cast-iron intake manifold. Under normal driving conditions in an American post-war suburb, only the center carburetor operated. It allowed the driver to cruise smoothly, quietly, and reasonably efficiently from a driveway to a grocery store. But when a driver pressed the heavy steel accelerator pedal to the floor, mechanical linkage pulled the outer two carburetors wide open simultaneously. In a garage or on a deserted highway stretch, the mechanical sequence was violent. The engine suddenly gulped massive amounts of raw fuel and air. The sound under the hood instantly shifted from a low, rhythmic idle to an aggressive, roaring suction. The J2 setup produced 300 horsepower and a staggering 415 pound-feet of torque. It delivered so much immediate twisting force to the rear wheels that early tire technology could barely maintain traction on the pavement. The J2 Rocket was so violently fast that NASCAR, the very racing organization that Oldsmobile had helped legitimize just 8 years earlier, officially banned multi-carburetor setups later in the 1957 season. The sanctioning body realized that the factory speeds were becoming lethal on the crude dirt and early asphalt tracks of the era. The J2 was forced off the professional track, but the ban only made the engine more mythical in the underground street racing culture. By 1959, the original first-generation rocket architecture was expanded one final time to a massive 394 cubic inches. The engine had become an absolute cornerstone of General Motors' profitability, and Oldsmobile was no longer just a car, it was a physical container for a specific, highly respected Lansing V8. The badge on the fender meant that the owner had paid for an independent, vertically integrated engineering division that cast its own iron and made its own rules. But the 394 was only the end of the first chapter. As the 1960s approached, the American highway system was completed, and the Rocket was about to grow into a displacement monster that would define the absolute peak of the muscle car era. As the 1960s began, the rules of American performance shifted from luxury straightaways to mid-size street dominance. Pontiac had aggressively escalated the internal General Motors rivalry by dropping a massive V8 into a smaller, intermediate-sized chassis, effectively igniting the classic muscle car era. Oldsmobile, the division that had essentially invented that exact power-to-weight formula back in 1949, refused to be left behind. To meet the new demand, the Lansing engineers designed an entirely new, second-generation Rocket V8 architecture. They introduced a 330 cubic inch version, followed quickly by a 400 cubic inch block. These engines were designed specifically to power Oldsmobile's new weapon for the streets, the 442. Originally, the number stood for a 4-barrel carburetor, a 4-speed manual transmission, and dual exhaust. It was a machine explicitly built for young, aggressive buyers who spent their weekends tuning ignition timing in suburban garages and their evenings cruising strips like Woodward Avenue in Detroit. But the true mechanical climax of the Lansing engine empire arrived in 1968. That year, Oldsmobile unleashed the 450 cubic inch Rocket V8. It was a massive piece of cast iron that defined the absolute ceiling of the American Torquey War. While other manufacturers focused on high horsepower engines that required high RPMs to make power, the Oldsmobile 455 was engineered with a massive stroke of 4.25 inches. A long-stroke engine means the piston travels a greater distance up and down the cylinder, creating massive mechanical leverage against the crankshaft. Because of this geometry, the 455 did not need to scream to be fast. It delivered a devastating 500 pound-feet of torque at incredibly low engine speeds. In an American street race, torque is the physical force that instantly plants the rear tires into the pavement and shoves the driver violently backward into the seat. A 455-powered Oldsmobile could overpower almost anything off the line before the opposing engine even had time to spin up to its power band. For the most demanding buyers, dealerships offered the legendary W30 package. When a customer checked the W30 box on the factory order sheet, they received a 455 Rocket that had been carefully assembled, balanced, and optimized at the factory. The package included specialized cylinder heads, a more aggressive camshaft to hold the valves open longer, and a forced air induction system that inhaled cold, dense oxygen through distinctive scoops mounted directly under the front bumper. The W30 cars even came with signature red plastic inner fender wells, originally designed to save a few pounds of weight, but which quickly became a visual warning at American stoplights that the vehicle was carrying factory-built racing hardware. This era represented the absolute peak of Detroit's decentralized, divisional power structure. Inside, General Motors, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Buick, and Chevrolet were technically part of the same corporation, but they operated like fiercely independent rival kingdoms. Oldsmobile engineers did not share blueprints with Chevrolet. They cast their own engine blocks in their own foundries. For mechanics and engine builders, this independence mattered deeply. Anyone working in an American machine shop knew that an Oldsmobile Rocket block was structurally different from a Chevrolet block. The Lansing foundry used a higher nickel content in their cast iron. This metallurgical choice made the Oldsmobile blocks heavier, but it also made them incredibly strong and resistant to cylinder distortion under extreme heat and pressure. It was an engine built to take abuse, engineered by men who believed their specific brand badge demanded a superior grade of iron. By 1970, the Oldsmobile Cutlass, powered by various iterations of the Rocket V8, was on its way to becoming one of the best-selling cars in America. The Lansing assembly lines were running multiple shifts. The dealer network stretched into every corner of the country, from small Midwestern farm towns to massive California lots, all selling a mechanical identity rooted in high-compression power. In an America where an engine could decide whether a field was cut, a truck made its delivery, a boat left the dock, a generator carried a hospital through a storm, or a car commanded absolute respect on a highway, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. The Rocket V8 was not just an option code, it was the beating heart of the Oldsmobile brand. The buyers trusted that when they paid a premium over a standard Chevrolet, they were buying the exclusive engineering, the high nickel block, and the deep, heavy idle that belonged only to Lansing. The system of factories, foundries, dealers, mechanics, and drivers was perfectly aligned. The Rocket had reached its physical peak, but the next threat would not come from a rival on the drag strip. It would come from the rulebook, the gas pump, and the corporate boardroom. The first crack in the Lansing engine empire did not begin with a mechanical failure, and it did not happen because buyers stopped wanting torque. It began with a memo. In early 1970, General Motors President Ed Cole issued a sweeping corporate mandate. Beginning with the 1971 model year, all GM engines had to be capable of running on lower-octane, unleaded gasoline. This was not a suggestion. It was an absolute engineering requirement to prepare the fleet for the upcoming adoption of the catalytic converter, an exhaust device that helps convert harmful engine gases into less toxic emissions, which would be destroyed by the lead traditionally used in gasoline. For the engineers in Lansing, this mandate was a devastating blow to the fundamental architecture of the Rocket V8. Since 1949, the entire identity of the Oldsmobile engine had been built on high compression. Squeezing the fuel and air tightly was how the Rocket generated its massive, immediate torque. But lower-octane fuel cannot withstand high pressure without detonating early and destroying the pistons. To comply with the corporate edict and the looming federal emission standards, Oldsmobile had to drastically lower the compression ratios across its entire engine lineup. The legendary 455 cubic inch Rocket V8, which had operated with a towering 10.5.1 compression ratio just a year prior, was suddenly dropped to a sluggish 8.5.1. In an American driveway in 1971, a buyer might open the hood of their new Oldsmobile 442 and see the exact same cast iron block they remembered from the late 60s. But when they turned the key and pressed the heavy steel accelerator pedal, the physical response was entirely different. The violent, immediate twisting force that used to shove the driver backward into the seat was gone. The engine felt breathless. The sharp, aggressive exhaust note had been muffled into a flat, labored hum. The situation worsened in 1972 when the American automotive industry shifted from measuring gross horsepower to net horsepower. Net horsepower, a measurement of how much power the engine actually produces when fully installed in the car with its alternator, water pump, air conditioning compressor, and restrictive factory exhaust attached, revealed the grim reality of the emissions era. On paper, the numbers plummeted. A Rocket V8 that had proudly advertised over 350 horsepower just a few years earlier was suddenly rated closer to 200. For mechanics working in dealership service bays, the early 1970s became an era of frustration. To meet the tightening regulations, factory engineers had to lean out the fuel mixtures and retard the ignition timing. The engines ran hotter. They hesitated off the line. Mechanics who had spent the previous 2 decades tuning Rocket V8s to run flawlessly on high-octane fuel were now forced to maintain engines that felt as though they were fighting against themselves. Then, in the fall of 1973, the geopolitical landscape fractured. The OPEC oil embargo triggered a massive energy crisis across the United States. Overnight, the American highway culture shifted. Gasoline prices spiked, and lines at the pumps stretched for blocks. Suddenly, a 455 cubic inch cast iron V8 getting 9 miles to the gallon was no longer a symbol of highway dominance. It was a financial liability. The market forces violently pivoted away from displacement and toward fuel economy. Families who had traditionally relied on heavy, powerful Oldsmobile sedans began looking at lighter, smaller, imported cars with 4-cylinder engines. Inside the executive boardrooms in Detroit, General Motors looked at their financial ledgers and realized they had a massive structural problem. For over 20 years, GM had operated on a decentralized system. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, and Oldsmobile each designed, cast, machined, and assembled their own unique V8 engines. If you wanted a 350 cubic inch V8, you could buy a Chevy 350, a Pontiac 350, a Buick 350, or an Oldsmobile 350. Each engine was completely different. They shared no internal parts. They required different foundries, different tooling, different assembly lines, and completely separate supply chains for replacement parts. Oldsmobile's 350 Rocket was heavily respected by engine builders because of its high nickel iron block and extreme durability, but that high nickel content made it expensive to manufacture. Chevrolet's 350, on the other hand, was cheaper to cast and easier to mass produce. This brings in force 6, corporate consolidation, the process where companies merge, acquire, or absorb independent divisions to cut costs. As emissions regulations made engines exponentially more expensive to design, and as inflation squeezed profit margins, GM executives decided that allowing 4 different divisions to build 4 different 350 cubic inch engines was an unjustifiable waste of money. The executives made a quiet decision to slowly phase out the independent engineering identities of their divisions. They would begin using a corporate engine strategy, treating the different branches not as independent engineering houses, but merely as marketing labels. The problem was that nobody told the buyers. The dealerships were still selling the Oldsmobile name. The brochures were still leaning on the historical legacy of the Rocket V8. The buyers still believed they were paying a premium price for Lansing's superior iron. The engine block was still heavy, but the corporate system above it had decided that mechanical identity no longer mattered. The trap had been set, and in 1977, the entire illusion of the Oldsmobile empire was about to crack wide open in front of the American public. The explosion happened in 1977. In dealership service bays across the country, mechanics and buyers suddenly realized what General Motors had done. A loyal customer would pay the premium for an Oldsmobile Delta 88, expecting the high nickel cast iron block, the smooth torque, and the mechanical identity that had defined Lansing engineering for decades. Instead, when they opened the hood, they found a 350 cubic inch Chevrolet V8. General Motors had quietly swapped the engines because the Chevrolet plant had excess capacity, and the Oldsmobile plant could not build their unique 350 V8 fast enough to meet demand while also complying with new emission standards. To the corporate boardroom, A 350 cubic inch displacement figure was just a metric. They assumed the buyer would not know the difference. They were catastrophically wrong. The discovery sparked the massive Chevy Mobile scandal. Over 65,000 furious buyers joined a class action lawsuit. The state of Illinois sued General Motors for consumer fraud. GM was ultimately forced to offer cash settlements or buy the cars back entirely. But the financial penalty was nothing compared to the psychological damage inflicted on the brand. The silent contract of mechanical trust had been broken. Oldsmobile was no longer an independent engine builder. It was being reduced to a marketing division that simply applied different grills and taillights to corporate hardware. Desperate to restore their engineering relevance and meet increasingly strict corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards, Oldsmobile was handed a new mandate by GM in the late 1970s: build a passenger car diesel V8. A diesel engine, an engine that ignites fuel by compressing air until it becomes hot enough to burn diesel fuel without using spark plugs, requires immense internal structural strength to handle the violent combustion pressures. Instead of designing a diesel block from scratch, the Lansing engineers were forced to heavily base the new engine on the architecture of their existing gasoline 350 V8. The result was the Oldsmobile 350 diesel, released in 1978. It was a mechanical disaster. While the block itself was reinforced, the factory used the same number and size of head bolts as the gasoline engine. The massive cylinder pressure of the diesel combustion simply stretched the bolts. Head gaskets blew violently. Coolant leaked into the oil. Fuel injection pumps, engineered without water separators in a time when American diesel fuel was notoriously dirty, failed constantly. In dealership service bays across the country, mechanics dreaded seeing an Oldsmobile diesel roll through the doors. The engine shattered whatever remaining trust the American public had in Lansing engineering. By the 1980s, the Rocket name was quietly stripped from the air cleaners. The torque wars were a distant memory. The final iteration of the Oldsmobile V8 was the 307 cubic inch engine. It was a durable piece of iron, but it was suffocated by a maze of vacuum hoses, air pumps, and early electronic emissions controls. In a heavy 1980s station wagon, the 307 produced a meager 140 horsepower. It did not roar, it labored. The Oldsmobile V8 had survived the transition to unleaded fuel, but it could not survive the transition to front-wheel drive. As the 1990s approached, the American automotive market aggressively shifted towards smaller, lighter, front-wheel drive platforms powered by transverse-mounted V6 engines. There was simply no physical room and no economic justification for a massive cast-iron Lansing V8 in the new corporate lineup. General Motors was streamlining its global supply chains, and unique divisional engines were an obsolete expense. In 1990, the Lansing engine plant cast and assembled its final Oldsmobile V8. The assembly lines were shut down. The foundries that had poured the 303, the 394, and the legendary 455 were silenced. The Oldsmobile brand limped on for another 14 years, selling cars powered by generic corporate engines. But without its unique mechanical heart, the brand had no distinct identity to offer the American public. In 2004, General Motors shut down the Oldsmobile division entirely. The blocks were swapped, the lawsuits were settled, the diesel shattered the trust, the rules strangled the compression, the foundries went quiet, the name became a sticker. The Rocket was finally dead. The world it built had moved on. But outside the corporate balance sheets, the original iron refused to die. Today, General Motors still builds automobiles in Lansing, Michigan. But the landscape of American manufacturing has fundamentally changed. The specific engine plant that once defined the Oldsmobile empire, the specialized foundries that poured the high nickel iron, the machining lines that cut the wedge-shaped combustion chambers of the legendary 455, and the assembly floors where the W30 packages were meticulously bolted together, belongs to a vanished industrial era. General Motors officially executed the Oldsmobile division in 2004, ending over a century of automotive history. The final cars to roll off the line did not carry a unique Lansing V8. They were powered by standardized corporate platforms shared across multiple brands. The brand died because it had no mechanical soul left to offer. But while the corporate entity was erased, the iron it left behind refused to disappear. Across the United States, a massive preservation and enthusiast community still fiercely guards the original Oldsmobile architecture. In traditional hot rod garages from Southern California to rural Ohio, engine builders still hunt for early 303 and 324 cubic inch blocks. For these mechanics, a period-correct 1932 Ford Roadster is not truly authentic unless it is powered by a first-generation rocket, exactly as the returning GIs would have built it in the early 1950s. Further down the timeline in the restoration shops of the American Midwest, muscle car collectors scour salvage yards and swap meets, looking for the specific casting numbers that identify a true high-nickel 455 block. They search out the J2 tri-power manifolds and the factory red plastic inner fenders of the W30 cars. At events like the massive automotive swap meet in Hershey, Pennsylvania, or the drag strips of the NHRA stock eliminator classes, the Oldsmobile engine is not treated like a dead brand. It is treated like premium, heavy-duty machinery. Engine builders still respect the iron because the iron still holds up to extreme cylinder pressure. This is not nostalgia. A 405 cubic inch Oldsmobile block sitting on a machine shop floor is a physical argument about how American industry used to work. It is concrete proof of a time when a single corporation allowed its different divisions to fiercely compete against one another. It proves that there was a long era when Detroit automakers believed their brand identity lived in their casting techniques, their metallurgy, their valve geometry, and their unique torque curves, not just their marketing budgets or their sheet metal styling. The engine block proves that mechanical independence once mattered to the American buyer. The surprise footnote of the Oldsmobile empire is that the Rocket V8 accidentally engineered its own demise. When Charles Kettering and the Lansing engineers proved the absolute superiority of the high-compression, overhead valve V8 in 1949, they terrified the rest of the industry. The rocket forced Chevrolet to scramble and develop their own overhead valve engine. The legendary small-block Chevy, released in 1955, because the Chevrolet version was brilliant, lightweight, and incredibly cheap to mass-produce, it eventually became the undeniable corporate standard. The Oldsmobile engineers had created the blueprint for the modern V8, but in doing so, they birthed the very Chevrolet engine that would later be lowered into the Delta 88 in 1977, breaking the trust of their own buyers. America did not stop needing V8 engines. It stopped needing divisions that fought each other to build the most expensive one. The market forces of emissions regulations, fuel economy pressure, and corporate consolidation demanded that horsepower become standardized, predictable, and shared. The executives in the boardroom looked at a spreadsheet and saw that a 350 cubic inch engine was just a number, regardless of who cast the iron. But they failed to understand that the American driver did not just buy a displacement figure. They bought the factory that made it. They bought the sound. They bought the trust. When General Motors outsourced the Rocket, they did not just save money on a manufacturing cycle. They stripped the Oldsmobile badge of its entire reason for existing. What vanished was not only iron, fuel, and horsepower. It was a fiercely independent way of powering American life. Yet somewhere in an American garage, an old 394 cubic inch Rocket V8 still sits mounted on a heavy steel engine stand. Its gold valve covers dented but shining under a fluorescent light, the high nickel block waiting to be rebuilt, proving that Detroit once built iron strong enough to outlive the company that poured it. See you in the next one.